So we are checking. We should be starting in about a minute now.
Sure.
We're set.
Yes, set.
Yes, it's 10 and we're going to start. Welcome to this Takshashila conversation. The Takshashila Institution is a network think tank and a school of public policy. Physically, we are located in Bangalore, but operating around the world since 2010 over the internet. As an independent, non-partisan policy research think tank, we're engaged with India's relationship with the world, transforming how India is governed and exploring the intersection of technology, economics, and politics. Please do take a look at our public policy education programs. They're tailored specially for people like you. They're all online and you can take them from anywhere. We have both short one semester certificate programs as well as a year-long graduate programs in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology, and biotech policy. By the way, admissions are open for the next intake now. To connect with us, please do subscribe to our newsletters and podcasts. Depending on your interests, we do deliver sharp and timely analysis that allow you to reduce the information overload and get to the heart of the matter. Now, over to you, Nitin, to begin today's conversation.
Thank you, Soumya. And it's a real delight to be on this program with Rory. Welcome, all of you. I see that there's a large number of you tuned in on a Saturday morning in India, and we have audience from Singapore, Australia, and the United States as well. Welcome, all of you, and we hope to make this a very great conversation. No, I'm not going to introduce Rory in the formal way, but I'll give you a personal introduction of Rory. I've known Rory now for over a dozen years, and we have been fellow travelers in one simple aspect, and that's the topic of this book, to say that the Indo-Pacific is a region of interest for both our countries. He was championing Australia's engagement in Indo-Pacific and its attitudes and policies towards China, which have now seen the light of day. And I was doing something similar in India, and we've moved the needle in both our countries. But I think Australia has been a lot more on the front foot as far as dealing with the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific are concerned. We have not yet stepped up. We, as in India, has not stepped up as much as I would like, and as probably as Rory would like. But welcome, Rory, to the Takshashila show. You're most welcome to our institution, our friends, and the participants on this program. And let's spend the next 90 minutes discussing your book. I mean, you sent me an advance copy of the book. You've acknowledged some of what I've said in the book, so thank you very much for that. It's a brilliant book. I liked it very much, and I think there are many parts of it which can be prescribed as readings for those who are taking an international relations course at this point in time anywhere in the world. So that's a fantastic book. It makes a great addition to the library of people who are interested in international relations and indeed in policy analysis. So Rory, let's just get to the heart of the matter first. Why don't you just tell us the key arguments in the book? What precisely are the arguments you're making, and maybe some insight into why you're making those arguments as well?
Look, thank you very much, Nitin, and it's a real pleasure to be with you. And I think just to preface what I'm about to say, I think also with an acknowledgement of the work that you've done personally, but also the whole Takshashila initiative, that idea of in some ways a virtual institute, a virtual think tank. It was ahead of its time, and it's great to see it going from strength to strength. But look, about the book and about my own work, the book was at one level an attempt to really weave together the work I've been doing and tracking over many years, the work of others that I've been tracking over many years as well, on building a new understanding, a new concept, a new narrative for our regional strategic order, the Indo-Pacific, a regional order that incidentally brings together the interests of India and Australia very much within a convergent framework. And we saw recently with the summit of our two prime ministers how real in many ways that is. But the book is trying to do, I guess, two things, and I will just try to give a snapshot of those two purposes of the book and the two layers of analysis that are really quite different but complementary. The first is that this is a book that attempts to describe and analyse our regional system, our regional order, and I think the great connectivity between the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, the submerged history, if you like, of this region as one system, rather than as an artificially divided set of sub-regions where somehow what happened in East Asia, what happened in South Asia, what happened in Australasia didn't matter to each other. So it's at one level, this description of a region in which, yes, China is rising and China's interests and capabilities are expanding, but in which also China is not alone, a multipolar regional order where the interests and the capabilities of many are intersecting. So that's the first part of the book. It's a narrative, it's a history book in many ways. That was probably the most enjoyable part to research and to write, and hopefully the part that will endure. But it's also a book trying to describe the layers of strategic competition and to some degree cooperation at the moment, economic, military, diplomacy, the whole propaganda war. And then in the second frame of reference, because it is two books in one, if you like, having looked at that very objective, I hope, way of analysing the region and making the case that our region is the Indo-Pacific and that it's a useful foundation framework for policy for our governments. The second dimension of the book is to take that and say, well, the Indo-Pacific is also the basis for a strategic agenda. It's also a foundation for an agenda to manage the disruption that comes with Chinese power and assertiveness, to also manage the uncertainties that I think many of us feel about the direction the United States is taking, and to build an agenda for agency and cooperation among the middle players. I don't necessarily say middle powers, because India in particular and Japan also have some attributes that go beyond middle powers, but to use the Indo-Pacific as a framework to collapse the old boundaries that kept our countries from cooperating with each other, and instead a situation now that enables us to work together to try to set limits to the coercive use of Chinese power and to build, I guess, the foundations for a more cooperative and inclusive region in the future. That's the two, in a nutshell, I guess, the two stories of the book. There's lots more to say, but maybe we can get to that during the conversation.
A little later. So I want to jump to another thing which is on the top of the minds of many of the people in India looking at this region now, and that's the tension on the common disputed frontier with the Chinese, right? With the Chinese. Now, if I were to ask you to frame that challenge in the context of the framework of your book, and what would that indicate? What would you suggest that India ought to do, given the framework of your book?
Sure. So again, the book embeds Chinese power in the real context in which it's rising, which is a multipolar context. And that is about getting beyond, I think, some of the two false narratives. One narrative where China portrays itself as being the center of a regional and global system. And my argument is that China is prominent, but not necessarily dominant in this wider Indo-Pacific region. The second false binary is this idea that everything is about China and the United States, that the only relationship that matters to the region's strategic future is that between China and the United States, and the rest of our countries don't really have agency. And so the China-India relationship, and also the manifestations of that relationship in tense circumstances such as the border dispute and the recent flare-ups there, that is of long-term importance to all the countries in the region. Why? Because at one level, of course, some kind of common understanding, sort of modus vivendi between India and China is going to be crucial to long-term regional and global stability. India is the only country to which China owes a kind of a debt of civilizational heritage and respect. And it's the only country that, as a megastate with so many human challenges to manage and so much human potential, India is the only, I guess, peer for China in that regard. So if China can't manage a relationship of mutual respect, even with India in that regard, we've all got a problem. Secondly, there's the example of other countries, whether it's India in some circumstances, or Japan or Vietnam or Australia in other circumstances, of other countries demonstrating that China is not all powerful and that its interests are not somehow to be respected over our own interests. Yes, we want mutual respect, but we want self-respect too. So there is a demonstration effect, the extent to which India can successfully manage and limit and blunt Chinese coercion on its border in any other form, that has a powerful emboldening and encouraging effect to other countries like Japan, Australia, Vietnam, even the Europeans, which themselves are now beginning to look for ways to assert their interests against China. Now, in all of this, I don't think any of us are looking for conflict. The last thing I think anyone wants to see is open conflict on the border between India and China. But as in the Doklam incident several years ago, the prolonged Doklam confrontation, I think the Indian government carefully, with some risk, but also with calibration of that risk, carefully managed Chinese assertiveness and demonstrated that India was going to take a stand. And I think that we see some elements of that in the current situation, but there's no question that this is very difficult for India, and it's very difficult for India, particularly at a time where your country is feeling the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course, ironically or not ironically, had its origins in China.
Right. So I'll come into more of, we'll sort of intersperse the present in the conversation about the book. But the book is really about the past, present, and the future. And I think that's a nice way of framing it, because you sort of make it a current affairs book with context, which makes it very interesting to read. But I was struck by the maps part of the book, because there were lots of stuff. I mean, there was a lot of stuff in the map section of the book which I didn't know, and I thought I should share this in the conversation and put you on the spot and ask you some questions. Right?
Sure.
So let me just share something which I have. Now, this, for those who have visited Australia, is Australia's most interesting souvenir. It's from an Australian publisher. It's called The Upside Down Map of the World. Well, really, I mean, it's an interesting perspective, although I wouldn't call it upside down, because there's no such thing as a up or a down, but the perspective of a south side up map is really something interesting. And this is one of the first things I picked up on my very first trip to Australia. So in a sense, I think what makes Australians interesting in this strategic affairs perspective is they start with this map, right? You guys, you sort of have this map, you've stared at it all the time. There is also a similar map produced by Himal magazine, which was called the map of the subcontinent, with the peninsula sort of right on top and the mountains below. So I think there is a lot of, and our Navy guys, our friends from the Navy who are here today would see this, would notice that this is very familiar. They also have a map like this, which I've seen in the naval academies being talked about and shared. So some of us are no strangers to this, but a lot of us are strangers to this map itself, to the fact that the oceans are a dominant part of our geopolitics, right? And the continents are, just part of the story. There is an oceanic story and a maritime story as well. I just put this up to sort of preface what I saw in Australia. But let me talk about bring up a couple of maps from Rory's book. And the first one is this. First two are these ones. Thomas Mitchell's pivoted map of 1848 and Hao Xiaogang's map of 2013. I'd seen the new map which the Chinese had put out, the one on the right, but I hadn't come across the 1848 map, Rory. What's the story here? Who was Thomas Mitchell, and what's the story of this map?
So look, this map is actually really a really important marker on my own Indo-Pacific journey, because I found this map reproduced years ago. Actually, it was actually in a book about thinking about the Australia-India relationship going back many years. And this map is from the journal of Thomas Mitchell, who was a Scottish-Australian explorer, an army officer in the 1840s. He is famous within Australia for having discovered, or at least mapped and identified and travelled an overland route from New South Wales, from Sydney in the southeastern corner of the country to the northern coast of the continent. And he did that because in modern parlance, he wanted to facilitate defence exports to India. In other words, he wanted to find a route for stockmen, for people to take horses, cavalry horses, that were being bred in New South Wales to the northern coast of Australia for export to India, of course, to the British or the East India Company Army of the time. But in publishing the journal of his explorations and publishing this map, he was at pains to identify the importance of Australia's, the emerging colonies, or indeed the emerging eventual nation of Australia's connections with its region, and the trade routes that were of strategic importance to us. And of course, those trade routes were to India, to Singapore, and indeed to North Asia, particularly Hong Kong. Now, of course, these were the days of the British Empire. This was about Australia's survival in relation to the British Empire. But the map for me was also stunningly contemporary, stunningly 21st century, because it accentuates the region that matters to Australia's interests and economy today, combining East Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia in a single frame. It brings together the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, essentially in this portrait-shaped view of Australia's region. It accentuates our northern and western coastlines as well. And interestingly, this map, which I guess resurrected in a speech at the Australian National University about 8 years ago to help push Indo-Pacific thinking in Australia, variants of this map are now quite popular within the Australian government. The Australian Defence Minister uses a very similar map today. And so I was doubly struck when I found the recent Chinese map, and it's quite clear that this Indo-Pacific worldview has resonance in Chinese thinking today as well.
Yeah, what strikes me is that, we've had a lot of debate on whether the Indo-Pacific is a coherent region or not. Mm-hmm. I must tell you the story of Asia, right? So when I was in Singapore, when I first went to Singapore in the early 90s, Asia meant East Asia. So it was ASEAN and a few others. And once China started growing and China's growth became apparent to China became a part of Asia. And then in the early 2000s, when India's growth story became apparent as well, then India also became part of Asia. So in a sense, the concept of what the East Asians call Asia was horribly self-selective, because even now, ASEAN is seen as a very effective organization, and it promotes itself to be a very, very coherent, very assertive organization, very successful organization. It neglects to mention that you have Myanmar, where there was an ongoing mass atrocity going on to the scale that it probably is a genocide, right? So you have all sorts of things, but there seems to be an East Asian fascination with success stories, right? So that is one reason why people were skeptical about this construct of the Indo-Pacific, because it seems to include only the kind of countries that you need and exclude the countries that are sort of inconvenient to your analysis, right? The other reason people were uncomfortable with the construct of an Indo-China, of an Indo-Pacific, is that it was seen as excluding India's engagement with Africa, because India sees itself as part of the Indian Ocean space, and the East African coast has been part of the Indian cultural and trade and economic and even political space for the last 2000 plus years. So that was the other argument, right? And then the third argument really was from the Russians and the Chinese, inspired by the Russians and the Chinese, who said that, look, this Indo-Pacific is really an extension of US foreign policy. It's got nothing to do with you guys. People like you, scholars like you in India, should not be I think the Chinese use a very patronizing term for this. You should not be confused or misled by the Americans into believing that this is something coherent. But you put Mitchell's map, and the framing of Mitchell's map is so, I mean, it's just one map answer to all of these things, because a direct, a vertical line from Calcutta down through Southeast Asia, Singapore, the Straits of Malacca, and into Australia, it's like almost the shortest route on that map, right? So, and maps are something which define how we look at the world and define politics even, because the kind of policies you make depend on how you see the map. Now let's take this comment into the house map of China's worldview. Doesn't it look to you that India seems to be at the heart of that new map?
Yeah, look at, I found this map really quite fascinating because there are a couple of factors. One is this map was produced, authorized obviously by the Communist Party and by the Chinese state 7 years ago, the year that the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. I don't think that there was a specific coordination of that timing, because I also take the view that the Belt and Road Initiative has grown in all sorts of ways that many of us didn't quite expect. I think a lot of the Chinese bureaucrats were caught by surprise by their own leader. But the coincidence is important because it tells us about the long-term worldview, the long-term ambitions, the long-term strategic mental map that I guess has become dominant in China. And this map, I'm told, is quite popular with the Chinese Navy, which is not surprising. What does it tell us? It tells us a few things. It tells us, one, that when our friends in China criticize the idea of the Indo-Pacific, and there's some famous lines from, I think, Wang Yi, foreign minister, saying that it will dissipate like ocean foam and that it's an attention-grabbing idea, they're really protesting a little bit too much. The fact is, China, in fact, has an Indo-Pacific vision, an Indo-Pacific strategy. It's called the Maritime Silk Road. It involves infrastructure, diplomacy, influence, naval presence, increasingly access and basing, and it's going to keep going. And this map captures some of that because it demonstrates a few things: the importance, the centrality of the maritime to China's vision. There's a big debate about whether the belt or the road, the land or the sea, which is more important. We can come back to that, but I tend to be a maritime guy. Secondly, it puts, you're right, India, but more specifically the Indian Ocean, at the center of things. And I think the Indian Ocean at the center of this world of relatively untapped resources. I mean, that probably doesn't count for the fisheries of the Indian Ocean, which are already heavily exploited by China and others. But resource-wise, the Indian Ocean is still space where there's a lot of activity yet to take place. It also brings Antarctica much more into play as, I guess, strategic real estate for exploitation in the future. And finally, the bit that I think really fascinates me is that the United States and the whole American continent they're in the map. You've got to look very closely for them, but they've been cut in half and thrown to the outer edges of the universe to demonstrate that they are, in wishful thinking for China, going to be peripheral. Well, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, let me take you to an older map before we move on to the rest. This is a fantastic map, and it's almost mirroring the two maps which we saw earlier, in the sense that you have almost like a slanted, it's not really north up, but slightly slanted. And again, tells you the story. So, what's the story of this map?
And this one is actually, I think, in a strange way, it's almost the most important map in the book. In fact, I've got a copy of it on the wall behind me to remind me of what's in it. And it pays very close attention. It's worth studying very closely, because this is the map of, I guess, what was considered to be the East Indies in European terms, from the first reasonably accurate world atlas ever produced. Now, you can quibble with some of the details of this map for accuracy, and when I notice that it has mermaids and sea monsters, I always remind people that they are actually no more mythical than the 9-dashed line. But this is quite an accurate depiction of most of the coastlines of the region. It was produced by the famous cartographer, or famous in his day cartographer, Abraham Ortelius of Antwerp, who, essentially a Dutch cartographer who consolidated all of the knowledge that European colonialists, explorers, adventurers, and also the Asian societies they encountered. It captured all of that knowledge in a single frame. Why is it so important? It is a map of the Indo-Pacific as we understand it today. That is, it has South Asia, it has East Asia, it has Southeast Asia, it has North America, importantly, and even a little hint of Australia, all in the one frame. Secondly, it accentuates the importance of coastlines and coastal ports. You'll see that almost all of the population centres are crowded into the coastal areas. And so, my book writes about the fact that maps are very arbitrary and artificial at one level. You can draw the boundaries anywhere, but this is an example of how, in thinking about the economic linkages, the population centres, the political connections, the power structures of the relatively early colonial European imperial era, the view was of the Indo-Pacific. And if you go to those other maps, the Australian, the Chinese, the various other maps of the region, we're looking at the same region today. And so, in fact, this reinforces the view that the Indo-Pacific was the relatively normal, it wasn't called that, but something that was a two-ocean system was a relatively standard way of understanding the region for much of history. And it goes back to pre-colonial history, of course, as well. So I do think it's worth studying this one closely.
Yeah, thank you. This is one of those maps which reminds me, a lot of people are very surprised when I argue that that Indonesia is a neighboring country of India. Yeah. And this is, it's 5,000 kilometers away. How could that be? Then you look at it, the southernmost tip of the Andaman's island and the northernmost island of the Indonesian chain, I think they're about 90 nautical miles away. That's really a stone's throw in a maritime parlance. Whereas Maldives, which we consider our neighbor, is about 2,000 kilometers away. So it's in a sense, our sense of geography is really constrained by the kind of political narratives we've been used to. And I think this is a time where those political narratives are changing. And therefore, I think the understanding of our world and the world around us, what's Indo-Pacific is not, we are in the Indo-Pacific, right? It's not that we have to venture into the Indo-Pacific. I've seen people talking about how the Indian Navy has to operate in the Indo-Pacific. The argument is, that's sort of absurd. We are operating in the Indo-Pacific. We've always been operating in the Indo-Pacific. It's just that we see that the Indo-Pacific now as a coherent geopolitical space where there is some politics being, which is being contained. Where, for example, somebody from, Spain probably does not have a role in the Indo-Pacific because it's an entirely different geographical theater, but the Indo-Pacific as a whole is a theater. And this is actually is quite important to this moment because India is thinking about theater commands. And General Menon, my senior colleague at Takshashila, has just published a paper on how India should be structuring its theater commands. And his view is that we need to have two maritime commands, a Maritime Command West and a Maritime Command East. And the Maritime Command East literally will be looking at the Indo-Pacific as its zone, right? And of course, it's a long jump from a paper from a think tank to a government policy. But I think we are in that zone today where these decisions are being made, and it's important for us to be engaged in a deeper conversation about this, especially for India. Now, let me take you back, let's say 5 to 7 years in Australia. And can you tell us the journey which the Australian political system took with respect to understanding the Indo-Pacific and, more importantly, its own relationship with China? Because all through the 90s, Australia's prosperity was based on trade and economics with China. And almost for 20 to 30 years, Australia's prosperity was underwritten by the economic engagement with China. And then in the past 10 years, you began to start worrying about some of these things, and then you went on a journey. In a way, it's similar to, it's similar to the situation today in India, where China is a big neighbor. We have massive trade and investment and economic engagement with China. That's important to us. But at the same time, we also have a political story and a security story, which we can't be oblivious to. So your experience and your telling of the Australian story will be interesting here.
Okay, no, that's great. That's a big story. I'll try to be sort of brief in my snapshot about it. And before I do that, just to sort of also note, going back to the map for a second, that there is a contemporary resonance from all of this, because, for example, with the Australia-India relationship now really strengthening, you've got talk about, in fact, you've got activity happening in Australia, Indonesia, India trilateral cooperation. So in a sense, that's fulfilling the promise of the way the region's been visualized for hundreds of years. It's quite logical because, as you say, we are in fact neighbors: Australia, India, Indonesia. It's a perfect triangle in that part of the Indo-Pacific. So the Australian journey on China, again, that's been of great interest to me over the past, really more than 5 to 7 years. It's been perhaps over the past 20 years, but it accelerated intensely, particularly in the past 5 years. The Australian view of the Indo-Pacific was actually reasonably pioneering in its way. I get very frustrated with some commentators who like to say that Australia does not have an independent foreign policy because we are an American ally, of course, which we are. And I push back on a number of counts on that topic. But one is, in fact, that in the 21st century, Australia was in fact the first country to formally, through official government documents, official government statements, reframe its region as the Indo-Pacific. We did that in our Defence White Paper 7 years ago. Now, back then, it was a slightly more benign, a somewhat more benign regional strategic environment. I think that a lot of the internal government advice behind that Defence White Paper was beware of Chinese power and coercion, but governments were much more careful talking about that in the public domain. But at that point, Australia had taken the first step, if you like, to embracing an Indo-Pacific version of its region, recognising the connectivity and recognising that Chinese power and influence were growing across this region into the Indian Ocean in particular. There was, however, still a sense in Australia that our strategic environment was manageable and that we could have this huge trade relationship with China, which we have and which obviously is of great value to us, but that we could somehow have this trade relationship without there being consequential risks to our national interests, to our sovereignty, to our values and so forth. What's happened in the past 5 years is that the economic, political and security dimensions in Australia's relations with China and our worldview and our own attitude to national security, these have all collided, and they've all collided both due to factors beyond our control, such as China's use particularly of political interference and influence inside Australia on a range of issues. But they've also deliberately collided. That is, the Australian government has, I think, in a quite conscious and generally enlightened way, begun to reframe policy so that we make security and economic and diplomatic policy all together rather than as completely separate strands. I guess that's all a little bit cryptic, but to get to the point in more tangible terms, I think the narrative of 10 to 15 years ago in Australia that China was all economic upside, and for the security community it was never like that, but in the general political mindset it probably was largely like that. That narrative came to an end, and in fact the risks began to be balanced with the opportunities, and in some ways began to outweigh the opportunities. And a really important turning point for that, which I recount in the book and which is reasonably well known in this country, was the exposure about 3 or 4 years ago of the extent of Chinese Communist Party interference and influence campaigns inside Australia, partly through the, I think, very unfair leveraging and infiltration and exploitation of parts of our very vibrant, diverse and independent-minded community of Australians of Chinese origin, and partly also through, for example, purchase and use of media organisations, Chinese language media, donations, political donations, and in one notorious incident, an attempt to use a political relationship with a rising star in Australian politics, which backfired and which ended with a controversy about South China Sea policy and the resignation of that politician, and importantly, a campaign of media reporting, investigative media exposés of all kinds of influence, and the introduction of laws to criminalise foreign political interference, which of course caused its own controversy in the China relationship. But so what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years has been a reality check in Australia, so that the new normal in Australian policy is about national interest, self-respect, national values, and trying to build a relationship with China on our terms. And at the moment, of course, Australia is in a very difficult situation with China, maybe slightly as a consequence of that pushback, but I think more as a consequence of China's, I guess, coercion and its expectations, its sense of entitlement that it can call the shots in this and other bilateral relationships. But I would emphasise, make no mistake, Australia has changed fundamentally on these issues, partly because of China's assertiveness internationally in the South China Sea and elsewhere, but even more because it crossed that threshold of interfering in domestic affairs.
So how does Australia, I mean, one of the important elements to Australia's Indo-Pacific strategy are the Southeast Asian countries lying in between, which is Indonesia and its neighbors, which constitute ASEAN, right? Now, how receptive have you seen the ASEAN community to the Indo-Pacific construct in general, and to Australia's perceptions of its securities and insecurities with respect to China in particular? Do you see the ASEAN, because one of the conversations, I mean, my own conversations with my ASEAN friends have always been, I spend 1 hour with them, I'm confused. I spend 3 hours with them, I'm confused. I'm spent 2 days with them, I'm confused. Because you do see some countries speaking very loudly about ASEAN having its own status in geopolitics. But when you ask them what does it mean in political terms, in security terms, they say, oh, we need more summits, we need to have more conversations, and so on. So you do see some countries in ASEAN which are more forceful in their thinking. I would put Singapore there, I would put Vietnam there. And to sometimes at some, during some phases of the moon, probably Malaysia there. But in general, you see a lot of waffling. You see a lot of an acceptance of the fact that the Chinese are here, and they are here, they are big, they are powerful, they can twist our arms. And there are also intellectuals in ASEAN who take pot shots at the West, knowing fully well that there are not going to be any consequences. You could write an article in the Straits Times of Singapore criticizing Donald Trump, and nothing happens to you. But you write an article in the Straits Times of Singapore criticizing Xi Jinping, and you get a phone call, right? So this is the sort of a leitmotif of what I see is happening in ASEAN. So what is your experience? How does Australia expect to carry ASEAN on its view of Indo-Pacific?
Look, I think the important starting point for that, of course, is to emphasise that this isn't an Australian agenda alone. And Australia has got its own history and complexity in its relations with ASEAN. I think one of the strengths of the Indo-Pacific idea is that it redefines the region, or it recaptures a definition of the region that automatically includes Australia, just as it automatically includes India. So we no longer have to have the debate we used to have in the 1990s or the 1980s, which is where do we belong? And that was a difficult debate because it gave particularly those voices in not only in ASEAN, but of course also particularly in China, who wanted to limit Australia's role in the region, or indeed exclude Australia from the region. It gave them a hook to say, well, look, you're not Asian, therefore if you're not Asian, you're not really of this region. Now, I think the good news is that that debate is history now. It's been transcended, as it should be. And of course, Australia itself, the way our country's evolved as a multicultural society, the Australia that is engaging with its region also increasingly wears a very Indo-Pacific face. We have large migration, whether it's from China, from India, or elsewhere. So with ASEAN, in particular, I guess the habit of Australian diplomacy has always been to work with and through ASEAN institutions wherever we can, and with ASEAN partners. We've tried to encourage regional community building, to be a part of that, and sometimes to step up precisely because our ASEAN friends want Australia to be the slightly pushy, slightly rude player in the room that calls out some of the sensitive issues, because that's often not the ASEAN way. But on other occasions, our ASEAN friends will want us to step back and respect their habits of consensus and dialogue and so forth. I actually think that on the diplomatic level, ASEAN's doing not badly, particularly the way in which Indonesia in the past 2 years has taken something of a leadership role in pushing ASEAN or pulling ASEAN towards its own Indo-Pacific outlook. So it's no longer true to say that ASEAN or Southeast Asians don't like the Indo-Pacific, as I recall, for example, one very Western analyst in Singapore once insisted to me. Of course, the good news pauses there, because when you get beyond dialogue and broadly worded common agreements on issues like the Indo-Pacific, it gets very difficult to build consensus in ASEAN on really substantial what do we do issues. For example, how to push back against China in the South China Sea, how to set common standards on a whole lot of issues, of course, and how to address human rights inside one another's countries. But I certainly don't think that Australia gives up on ASEAN there at that point, because we've got to remember that institutionally, a lot of the institutions that are ASEAN-centric, like the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defence Ministers Meeting +8, all of this architecture that's grown up in the past 20 years that is often called ASEAN or East Asian architecture, well, the secret is that it's actually Indo-Pacific architecture. These organisations include Australia, they include India, they include the United States. In some cases, they have mechanisms for engaging more widely, for example, with Europe or with the Indian Ocean structures. So I think the ASEAN game is still on, and another cause for some degree of confidence is that a number of individual ASEAN countries, with their own frustrations with the ASEAN system and the, for example, Chinese exploitation of proxies like Cambodia to block consensus, some ASEAN countries are also in parallel doing their own things. So they're saying all the right things about ASEAN institutions, but they're not letting consensus diplomacy drive their every move. Vietnam is, a substantial military power and quite capable of not only looking after its own interests, but increasingly creatively working with others like India and Australia and Japan and the United States, and allowing us, for example, to work with Vietnam on building up its own capacities, its own capabilities. Indonesia, I think in many ways is still in play, and of course is going to go through a very difficult phase now with the impacts of COVID-19, as I fear is India as well. But if we take a long view, Indonesia is still going to be a substantial power and a substantial economy in the region, and it has its own national self-respect, it has its own nationalism, and there are some limits, I think, to which China can push it. So I guess that's the more positive side of working with ASEAN. And the final point I'd note is that even when China manages to intimidate or infiltrate parts of ASEAN, it still has to play the game. And so again, those ASEAN-centric institutions give us venues where we can build caucuses, such as the Quad or Quad Plus mechanisms, and the Quad Plus Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand is a fantastic new mechanism looking at COVID response and other issues. And if we're more active and smarter about it, we can start to use the ASEAN institutions a bit more practically to call out bad behaviour by big powers, especially by China.
Right.
But it's going to be it's a constant challenge and involves a lot of mental
I've always
gymnastics.
felt that many ASEAN countries, you can almost draw a line between and divide them into two groups of ASEAN countries. One bunch of them feel that it's easier for them to bandwagon onto whichever is the dominant power there. So they just need to, just benefit from the generosity or the protection offered by the dominant power in Southeast Asia. So the bandwagoning works wonderfully for them. And they're willing to make the compromises necessary to bandwagon. And then there's the other bunch of countries which try to balance. And these are the kind of, these are the powers who are looking towards India, towards Australia, towards Japan, towards the United States, and even towards Europe to say that, can we have a constructive balance here that allows us to sort of protect our sovereignty and independence and autonomy. Now, the ASEAN seems to be in this tussle, right, between the bandwagoners and the balancers. And at various times, you find one or the other getting a stronger expression. So in that sense, from at least sitting here in Bangalore and looking east, I don't get the confidence that ASEAN countries will necessarily be supportive of any measures to protect our interests, which are affected by China, right? For example, I've made the argument that the Indian Navy should be sailing a lot more in the South China Sea, because the more we sail there, the more we will be able to manage our relationship with China in the Himalayas, right? I think I'm persuaded that argument works. But many of the the kinds of pushbacks I've received is that, look, I'm not quite sure that the ASEAN countries, all the ASEAN countries want us there. And if we do not get enough cooperation from the ASEAN country at a diplomatic and on the ground, then our engagement will be that much more resisted, that much less successful. Because of the resistance of the ASEAN countries. So that's been a worry for me from the ASEAN angle. But if you look at the Quad countries, I mean, it's a very different story. Although when push comes to shove, I still don't know whether the Quad, as it stands today, will be one for all and all for one. There is still a possibility that the countries of Quad might defect and say, look, this is not our fight. We don't want to worry. And I think a lot of people in New Delhi worry about that, because we are the only country which has an undisputed land border with China. Only Quad country that has this border with China where troops are facing off each other. Japan has a maritime dispute, but it's not quite the same as eyeball to eyeball, 6 inches away from you. So that worries people in New Delhi. I would be concerned about it too. But let's quickly take this question of the United States as an example, and then move on to other things. But do you think the United States, with or without Trump, would sort of hold up its end of the bargain should push comes to shove?
Depends what the bargain is and the circumstances. But I think there's a lot to worry. There's a lot of worry to be had about the United States at the moment and for the past few years, and probably for the near future as well. And nor do I think that the United States is miraculously going to turn itself into the America that we thought it was a few years ago, or the America that it could have been, perhaps, if the last 5 years hadn't happened. But none of that detracts from the fact that the United States is a massive and global power, that it still has every chance over time of holding the position as the world's largest economy, at least by exchange rate terms. It has the capacity to renew and reinvent itself. And here's where things are really, I think, most important for our region. The United States has, in the past 2 to 3 years, I think, reached a point where it recognises the need across the political spectrum and into the business community as well, a need to comprehensively compete with China. And that's not the US of 5 or 10 years ago. It's perhaps only the good thing that's happened in American foreign policy under Trump, and it probably would have happened regardless of Trump, but who knows. So the United States is going to compete with China across technology, geoeconomics, military capability. And it's very difficult to see how the United States can sustain that competition if it's not engaged in the Indo-Pacific. And so, in a way, I think that we need to prepare our countries for a future where America may no longer see a need to seek primacy, and that's probably a good thing, but where the United States is still going to be formidable and in many circumstances still the most powerful actor, perhaps not in particular concentrated parts of the Indo-Pacific, but across the region widely and globally. And we need to find ways to encourage and leverage that, but without doing that thing that a sensible American administration would not want us to do, and that is to be the proximate cause of crisis that compels America to get involved in major confrontation. We want the crises not to be of our making. And there may be crises, there will be crises, misjudgments, miscalculations by China. But I think that we can and will still be able to engage America on our terms. And of course, for Australia, this matters in many ways more than it does for India, because America is our treaty ally. And in our case, we have expansive interests and obviously very finite capabilities. India too has enormous interests, but is probably more capable, in fact, is more capable of autonomously defending itself at this stage than Australia is. Just to go back to this question of when push comes to shove, or, you know, when the chips are down, or whatever metaphor we want to use, what will America do and what will the other members of the Quad do? Look, I think that we should also work in a framework of how to influence and manipulate China's perceptions and China's decision framework. I would still take a view that China has this strange, almost a kind of risk aversion, along with its determination to give us the impression that it is very, very risk tolerant. So there's a gap between the risk that China wants us to think it will take and the risks that it will actually take in a whole lot of crises. Very sensitive issue, because if we get this wrong, we have escalation on our hands. But we saw in Doklam 3 years ago, we saw over many years in the Japan-China confrontation, we've seen circumstances at sea. We've seen circumstances where China does redefine its own thresholds and not cross them. And I think that with the United States in particular, especially if the US can be more systematic in the way it competes with China, as I think is likely in the years ahead, if we get through this very difficult year, there's going to be potential for the Quad members and others to work together to, I guess, try to influence those Chinese threat perceptions. That still doesn't answer your question of, well, you know, if there's open armed conflict, for example, do you have suddenly, you know, American, Japanese, Australian and other forces suddenly charging to frontline roles or to the rescue or anything like that? I think that's unrealistic, just as I don't think that the Japanese are expecting the Indian Navy to turn up next time there's a skirmish around the Senkakus. But that's actually not the point, because we're talking about many layered strategic competition. And I think we are, all of us, strengthening the ways in which we support each other beneath the surface, behind the front lines, capacity building, cyber, critical technologies, intelligence sharing, training our forces together, technology transfer. There's a whole lot of things that we can do short of being there at the pointy end in each other's confrontations. Of course, in the future, who knows? If China, through its missteps and its assertiveness, does actually manage to somehow harden the balancing arrangements around it, who knows? But I think that's unlikely at this stage.
Okay, so Rory, I'll ask you one question before we go on to the Q&A. But before that, for those of you who are joining us on YouTube and Facebook, and those of you who are participants, please put in your questions now. because right after the conversation, the next question I'm going to ask Rory. Right after that, I'm going to be taking your questions and posing it to Rory. So this is your chance. Please put in your questions now, Rory. In the future part of your book, you talk about black swans. We talk about various sort of black swans. And a couple of months after your book was published, we had this COVID-19 black swan, right? So what's your reading of the Indo-Pacific in the post-COVID world? Let's not even get to the post-COVID world. In the COVID world, right? As we deal with this, how is this pandemic affecting the geopolitical arrangements and also the economics of this region?
Thanks, Nitin. I would actually almost call it the COVID and after world, because I think that that a lot of the patterns that are formed this year in the way our countries are responding to the crisis and the way that we're cooperating with one another, or the way in which particularly the mistrust with China seems to be hardening, I think it's going to set a pattern for a number of years to come. So the book went to print in early January of this year, probably before even the Chinese leadership quite realised the extent of the black swan that they had on their hands. And of course, I would almost redefine COVID as a black elephant, that is a black swan crossed with the elephant in the room. It's a problem. It was a risk that was in some ways, in retrospect, so obvious and so big that no one wanted to deal with it. But anyway, the book does talk a lot about the strategic shocks and trends and disruptions of the next 10 years. I mention in the final chapter of the book the possibility of pandemic, but in fact, in my innocence, I surmise that perhaps a pandemic would be really good for building a little bit of coexistence, cooperation and trust with China rather than a worsening sense of crisis. So in many ways, the glass half empty side of that analysis is what has come true, not the optimistic side of it. How does all this unfold now? I do think China generally has lost an opportunity for a comprehensive regional charm offensive. The narrative is kind of clear now. Disease or virus first comes on the scene in Wuhan. Chinese truth suppression domestically prevents good management of that problem for at least a couple of weeks and gives the rest of the world less time to prepare. Through very, very draconian measures, the PRC finally gets on top of things internally, while the pandemic actually has a much greater impact, it appears, in many other countries around the world. And then, of course, we get a kind of belated charm offensive by China, an attempt to say a mixture of we're here to help and, oh, by the way, our system's better than yours. What I think China has underestimated is the amount of long-term mistrust and resentment this whole situation is causing in so many other countries, so many other societies. So you've got in Europe, in Africa, much of the world now, I think, a hardening of views focused on risk and China in the same sentence, at least as much as opportunity and China in the same sentence. On the other hand, the Chinese system has exploited the chaos in recent months to maintain a lot of its pressure and its assertiveness, domestic control, external assertiveness, economic coercion against my country, coercion on the border against your country, crackdown in Hong Kong and the removal of the facade of one country, two systems and so forth, more pressure on Taiwan and so forth. Where does this leave us? I think the response to the pandemic is doing some really interesting things. One is, yes, it's causing a lot of grief, literally, in a lot of our societies and in China as well. And so the resilience of many of our societies is being tested. And I think what we'll find is that a lot of our countries are probably in the long run going to cope perhaps better than we thought they would. And in fact, publics will have a new, I guess, respect for what government needs to do for them and how all parts of the country, government, civil society, business, need to work together in facing common threats. That's important because that has a relevance to how our countries face up to geopolitical threats in the future. Secondly, our economies are all taking obviously a terrible hit from this. It's staggering to look at a country like Britain that's taken a massive economic hit, but even India and Australia and others will take a lot of a hit. So we won't have the resources for the kinds of capabilities that we needed for our own security. And even then, we were already struggling to meet our own needs. This all places a new premium on partnerships. So in a sense, the risks are heightened, mistrust of China is heightened, uncertainty about America is still there. We need to do more with less, but our populations are probably going to be more supportive of government and of a kind of national security ethos than they would have been a few years ago. And by the way, our diplomacy with one another is accelerating and amplifying. And so, for example, the Australia-India virtual summit last week, comprehensive strategic partnership between our countries on everything from cyber to critical minerals to maritime, that was already underway, but I'm sure it's a stronger agreement because of COVID than it otherwise would have been. And our relations with others like Japan, likewise, Quad plus. So look, I do see an acceleration of the strategic competition trends that my book talks about because of COVID-19. And in some ways, although it would appear that it makes China more powerful in the short term, relatively speaking, and more confident in the short term, relatively speaking, it also actually expands the risk of overreach by China at multiple points of friction around China's periphery, from India to Hong Kong to Japan to the South China Sea, to its geoeconomic clashes with Australia, Europe, and others. More and more cases where something could go wrong, and a new heightening of nervousness internally about the relationship between economic well-being, public health, nationalism, and the Communist Party's sense of control. So both risk and opportunity, but at this stage, I think the broad idea that there remains a degree of Indo-Pacific solidarity and connectivity that our countries can work with to, not to contain China, but to find a kind of settling point for China's ambitions that respects our interests and our values. I think that that story is going to be alive and well for some years yet.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the diplomatic front, because I think I must acknowledge the Australian Consulate General in Chennai for South India, Susan Grace and her colleagues. They've been fantastic, and I've seen them on the ball, pushing the envelope in so many ways. It's just amazing. And two other people which come to mind would be Peter Verghese and his brilliant India strategy paper, which we sort of hold up as a way you would write a document, right? Just the elegant way it's written, the kind of analysis that went into it is just brilliant. And of course, the outgoing Ambassador Harinder Sidhu, both from her defense white paper work as well as taking charge of Australia-India relations at this point, the last few years has been amazing. So I think Australian diplomacy has something to cheer about in various ways in helping to make this happen. Now let's just move on to the Q&A. We've just hit the 11 o'clock mark, so I should really getting the audience into the conversation. Let me start with campuses. There were two questions. Okay, I must tell you something. Some of our defense and foreign affairs students are bunking their classes to attend this, and I can see some names there. So I know that you guys are bunking the other lectures happening in parallel. So I could see that you're here, and the rest of them are going to actually catch this on the recording or the YouTube recording right after. So I suppose those of you who bunked, I could ask the question here. Okay, there are two questions. One from Deepankar, who's clearly not bunking, he's an alum. Deepankar has this question on the campuses. China Chinese influences on Australian university campuses, and is there on something on which a partnership is needed? And the second is more of I think a person wants to know which Australian universities teach South Asian policy that would help us understand all of this a lot better. So since you are the dean of the of a college yourself, so you're probably best placed to advise this person on which department they should go to.
Okay, so look, there's a very live debate in Australia about the relations that our universities have, I guess not so much with the Chinese state, but with their reliance on student fees from PRC students over a number of years. And of course, that's heightened now because due to the travel restrictions from COVID-19, essentially there are very few foreign students, international students coming to our universities at the moment. That might lift again pretty soon. There's, when I spoke earlier about the Australia-China relationship and how for many years there was a sense that we could have all of the economic benefits without the security risks. That clearly was, I think, a naivety that parts of our university system were complicit in for their own reasons of revenue raising, and to be fair on them, partly because they were or felt to be sort of significantly underfunded by government. And really it became a bit of a sorcerer's apprentice, this whole situation of relying on more and more and more income from particularly the Chinese student market led to a lot of expansion and outlay and ambition in universities that is probably going to prove to be unsustainable. And so the whole party looks like it's over for the moment. What I would say, though, is that some of the perceptions that Australian universities have therefore become heavily compromised, that's a little bit unfair. I think there are instances of some universities getting involved in research projects that were moving into dual-use technology and in that grey zone where, for example, there were fellow researchers who were proven to have PLA affiliations. That's obviously going to be an area of security concern, and there's now a very strong framework and a degree of crackdown and risk management coming from government to change that. So I'm not as worried about that as I would have been a couple of years ago. At the same time, there have been some instances, and there's one obviously very well-known case at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, where the argument is made that freedom of speech has been threatened, that the freedom of other students to dissent against the human rights abuses or the other abuses of the Chinese government, where that's been compromised. And I do think in this particular case of the University of Queensland, which is before a whole bunch of court processes, so I probably shouldn't say too much about it, but in this case, it is clear to me, I think, that university lost sight for a time of, I guess, its proud traditions of being a haven, actually, for unpopular forms of civil dissent, or all forms of civil dissent. But again, the media spotlight is on this heavily now, and I think the tide is turning, and government, particularly the Australian government, the Commonwealth government in Canberra, is really mindful of this issue. So I actually see that the tide is going to turn in Australian universities on this, and freedom of speech will be upheld. But to end on that point, what is going to change, and what is already rapidly changing, is a move away from the reliance on Chinese student income. International students are welcome, are invited. Chinese students really must be a large part of that mix. And of course, there are now threats of, if you like, the use of travel advice by the Chinese government to coerce Australia to portray Australia as racist against Chinese students, and therefore to discourage those students from coming back. And that is, I think, an act of economic coercion, but it's happening at a time when it's an academic matter because the students are not here anyway due to COVID. Whatever happens, our universities will, I think, increasingly diversify their international student body, probably return to relying more heavily on domestic students and prioritise that whole domestic student experience, while also being a welcoming place for international students. And I hope engage with government and industry to build much more of a properly funded national research and teaching base in a world where, let's face it, universities, industry, business, these are all now frontline actors in that comprehensive strategic competition that I write about in my book. To go to that question about where's a good place to really get a handle academically on South Asia and Australia's relations and insights in South Asia, look, the brutal truth is that in some ways Australia used to be better at this than we have been in recent years. My own university, the Australian National University, has a very strong tradition of the whole gamut of Asian studies and area studies, including on South Asia. Other universities, University of New South Wales, University of Melbourne, University of Sydney, have all had their niches as well. University of Western Australia looking at the Indian Ocean. I wouldn't say at the moment that there's any one place that really stands out. I do think there's a very impressive niche with, in addition to my own university, ANU, an impressive niche with the Griffith Asia Institute at Griffith University in Brisbane. But again, a lot of this relates to individual scholars who do what they do well. So I guess my advice is do a pretty comprehensive survey of not just the universities, but the scholars you want to work with and the issues. And also, even through your own interest and that of other prospective students, you can actually probably drive a bit of change and reinvestment in Australia's need to understand South Asia.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll take two questions, and they're both about China. So one from Minlun and the other from Gaurav Jabuli. I think both of them are really about sizing up China, assessment of China. Let me read out Gaurav's question. What do you think are the main underlying reasons for the increasing Chinese assertiveness in the past 6 to 8 years under Xi Jinping's leadership? What is the strategic calculus that is driving this, and why does the Chinese leadership believe that it is productive? This is a productive long-term approach at a time when China is still some way off from matching the US in terms of military, economic, and technological capabilities.
Yeah.
So it's a question of reading China.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's many questions in one. So again, I'm someone who probably 10 to 15 years ago was, I wouldn't say I was maybe dovish or naive about China, but I certainly took a view that we could do more in engagement with China, and that the future direction or trajectory of China was not yet destined. It was not yet written. There was a phase of relative reform, relative opening. I can say that probably between about 2006 and probably 2014, I had a lot of conversations with Chinese scholars and officials and think tankers and so on that were relatively independent in, if you like, a lot of what they had to say about world affairs. I think this changed really quite profoundly from about 2010 onwards, but accelerated under Xi Jinping and has worsened greatly in the past probably 5 years. And that is, it seems to be a renewal of the decision that the party took in the early 1990s to focus on nationalism and patriotic education, basically extreme nationalist indoctrination as a basis to cement its legitimacy. And this has had a terribly distorting effect on policy and debate within China. Secondly, though, this was also very much the choice that Xi Jinping made in the early phases of his leadership, that he would focus so heavily on the, the international greatness side of China's rise, and he would tie his own legacy and legitimacy and the continued legitimacy of the party to this, this very, very difficult thread between internal control and external assertiveness. And so you've had, at the same time, the Belt and Road externally, and you've had worsening internal repression and surveillance with no end of that in sight. What's the strategy? What's the plan? I do think that we are sometimes a little bit too in awe or too generous in thinking about China as the place of great long-term grand strategy that always gets it right. If that was the case, then the one-child policy would never have happened. So China makes mistakes in its long-term strategy, just like the rest of us. I fear that there's almost a kind of automatic or impulsive chain of events that are set in motion now. I think it is a tiger that it's very hard for the Chinese leadership to get off. I don't think Xi Jinping wants to get off the tiger, but I'm sure that even others in the Chinese system who might think that really this is a dangerous, destructive course, they're going to have great trouble in making a course correction. I would say that through this phase of intense nationalist assertiveness over the past 5 to 10 years, and partly because many others, and especially the Americans, didn't push back in the early phases, so that in a way, the Chinese security establishment couldn't believe its own luck at first that it was being so successful. These habits have now been locked in, whereby legitimacy of the party at home, legitimacy of the leadership are tied to expanding assertiveness abroad. It's got to keep moving, if you like, a bit like a shark in order to stay alive. And what I fear is that, firstly, a whole lot of trigger points have been almost established in China's external relations about what is unacceptable to the leadership, what is unacceptable to the party. And so that moments of risk and escalation are now actually being caused not necessarily by China's choices, but by the way China reacts to the very trigger points that it's set for itself, a bunch of traps that it's set for itself in the relationship with India, with Japan, with Southeast Asia, with Australia, with Europe and others. So it simply takes the Australian government to suggest that maybe it's a good idea that we know where this virus came from, that has ravaged our economy and ravaged other countries' populations and economies much more than us. Or it simply takes, as may happen in the weeks ahead, Japanese local government to take further action on the legal status of the Senkaku Islands. Or it simply takes Indian road building and infrastructure building in the mountains, that these become triggers where the Chinese system almost has no choice but to act. You know, likewise with the resistance in Hong Kong. And therefore, in a sense, as I argue in my book, there's almost a compulsive empire in the making, an accelerated imperial project, and an imperial project that, in fact, ultimately Chinese strategists and planners are going to have a lot of difficulty in controlling, and therefore that sows the seeds of its own crisis points. I wouldn't say destruction, because I don't know how the story ends, and I'm not, I don't think that China's headed for collapse, but I do think that China is headed for a whole range of risky circumstances that it cannot control. And the challenge for us is to build, firstly, a sense of, a very, very good strategic understanding of this in our countries, and a sense of what are the opportunities, where is the risk calculation that we can play with to limit Chinese power, but also, here's where I'm going to be slightly sympathetic to China, a mindset where in the long run, we're not just looking after our own national interests, we're actually looking for those opportunities to almost try and help this Chinese system find some points where its assertiveness can slow down, settle and stop before we reach critical crisis points that that nobody can control.
That leads us to the next set of questions, and that's really about the Quad, right? So Akshay and Salil have a similar set of questions. I think Akshay's question is a lot more pointed, and I think that will form I'll just read that out and you could answer that. Can the Quad Plus become a formal military alliance and the center of Indo-Pacific security architecture, much like NATO was for the Atlantic during the last Cold War? What are the what are the barriers that need to be overcome for this to happen? And Salil has a sort of a related question. Says, I'm curious about the reasons why Australia is not participating in the Malabar exercise.
Okay, so I'll come to those. I just want to add one thought to that previous point about China's strategy, and that is to make the obvious point as well that I think there has been a recognition for a long time in the leadership now that they cannot rely purely on economic well-being or continued economic growth as that basis for legitimacy. So that was one of the factors in that re-emboldening of nationalism, and also, of course, a fear that that the rest, or that the opening up of freedoms would lead to a kind of Soviet Union type collapse. But also, I think there is a recognition in the system that China needs to lock in its gains now as assertively as it can, because things are only going to get harder 10 to 15 years from now, when China's own internal problems are greater, the demographic problem, the aging population, debt, and so forth. And of course, 10 to 15 years from now, it's likely that the relative power of others, such as India and Indonesia and Vietnam, for that matter, are going to continue to rise, even if, you know, as we expect, our countries won't get everything right. On the Quad, so I am very wary of the idea of the Quad as being somehow a formal alliance in the making. In fact, one of the first pieces I wrote on the Quad about, 12 years ago was, I think I called it the Phantom Menace, Chinese ghost story. You know, the Quad was much more threatening in appearance than in reality, but it had this wonderful quality of being a kind of a lightning rod for Chinese anger. So the Chinese diplomatic démarches and pressure were all directed against the Quad, whereas the real work at building capabilities, solidarity, coalitions, that was all happening in the bilaterals and the trilaterals below the umbrella of the Quad. I think that is still broadly true, but of course now we have no problem in you know, overtly having the Quad back, and now at a ministerial level too. That doesn't mean it's going to turn into NATO anytime soon, and nor does it mean that it's going to become the core of NATO. You know, NATO is an utterly exceptional alliance. You know, many formal members bound by a very clear treaty arrangement with all kinds of pooling of capabilities and trigger points for action. I don't think it's ever going to be quite like that in the Indo-Pacific, and it's probably good that it isn't. We actually need some ambiguity and flexibility, because most of the time, most of the issues are not going to be as clear-cut as, you know, all-out war or territorial invasion. But there's so much more that Quad members can keep doing to put flesh on the bones, to build processes underneath the ministerial dialogue, to build, I think there's no reason now that we can't start moving to formal exercises, formal military exercises, or information sharing among, or maritime surveillance sharing among Quad members, which is already happening in bilats and trilats, could happen quadrilaterally. How we do the add-on to the Quad, though, that's really tricky and interesting. And I think in a way, what I would see is that the Quad remains as this gradually strengthening core, and around it you have multiple pieces of architecture that are functional and fit different purposes. So, for example, on the COVID response, and I think likely on other issues like how our countries work together to manage our supply chains and protect our interests in a post-COVID world, the fact that the Quad plus Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand are in regular dialogue with one another, that's a really important point. The Quad plus the French or the British, or both the French and the British, particularly with a focus on the Indian Ocean, I think becomes another really interesting possibility. I'd like to see Singapore engage more openly with the Quad. Singapore's peculiar in some ways because it is a very capable military power for a country of its size, and it actually does do things to protect its sovereignty, such as expel alleged foreign agents, but it's yet very wary of getting on board with formal arrangements with Quad members, or even using Indo-Pacific terminology. But the more that China puts pressure on individual countries like Singapore or Vietnam, the more they become prospects for at least opportunistic one-off Quad plus arrangements. It could well be that next time there's a major natural disaster or a humanitarian crisis, or the need for a stabilisation mission, again, the Quad could form a core and different partners could plug in based on their interests and their capabilities. That's about as much as I see it at the moment, and I think that's probably sufficient. What would tip the balance to the kind of scenario that I think your colleagues are alluding to would be, again, some extraordinary act of confrontation by China with one or more Quad members at the same time. And unfortunately, that is not beyond the realm of possibility, but we're not there yet. On Malabar, I've never been obsessive about the Australia must be in Malabar line. And in fact, I think the Australian government, to its credit, at least in publicly, has been pretty relaxed about this and persistent. Of course, it makes sense that we are in Malabar, just as we have the Quad. At the same time, we can achieve a lot of the benefits of quadrilateral maritime exercises without officially being in Malabar. So bilaterally, trilaterally, we're doing advanced things anyway. Bilaterally with India, Australia has been doing anti-submarine warfare exercises, which are a pretty sensitive area. So, yeah, I think the last thing we want is to make the Malabar issue a kind of a litmus test for the relationship, especially because it also then becomes an instrument for China and the critics of our bilateral relationship or our quadrilateral relationship to simply say, look, I told you so, there's no real solidarity, China's going to divide and rule. Sorry.
You've answered many of the questions which are related to this, which are on the panel. So I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go through them. Deepankar has another interesting point about technology, various kinds of technology and cyber. And I really think that looking ahead, this seems to be a very interesting angle of cooperation with Australia, because it also links to academics, right? There's a very close link between academics, university, education, R&D, and the technology industry. And I would add biotech to that as well, where these are the two areas which I think look to me to be the most promising areas of cooperation in a increasingly fractured world. And in a world that is increasingly skeptical about China's investments, roles, and technology partnerships. So I would see an Indian government to far more open to technology partnerships with Australian entities on almost any kind of technology there is, as opposed to China, for example. And the English language brings us together, and you wouldn't have the same kind of a even with countries like Germany and Japan, which are like-minded, but the language barrier gets into the way of scientific and technological cooperation. A lot of electrical engineers don't like to learn new languages, and that helps a lot. So I think, what do you think? Would you think that squares with what you're thinking about?
Yeah, look, I think I was struck by the content of the comprehensive partnership that was announced last week, the fact that there is a specific sub-agreement on cyber cooperation, and there are other sub-agreements that talk about frontier technologies or critical technologies, and indeed the resources that those technologies need, the critical minerals that Australia can in fact mine, and in theory, Australia mining and India processing would be, or vice versa, would be a great combination. On cyber and really the whole technology spectrum, and let's touch on 5G for a moment. I think India, Australia, and many other countries see India as being an absolutely critical player, and the decisions that India makes and the choices that India makes as to whether it's going to, I guess, be more national security minded in a lot of its critical infrastructure and its development of technologies, that's going to have an impact on many other countries. It's going to set a standard, particularly for much of the developing world. It's also going to help be a measure of whether, in fact, we can have the kind of full spectrum strategic relationship that we want. Because, to be frank, we all want security partners who we can trust with our information, because we know that they take as good care of our information as they do of their own. So Australia wants India to be cyber resilient, and I'm sure India wants Australia to be cyber resilient. Having said that, I think the one of the big tests ahead now is how we put these agreements into practice, and particularly how private sector actors in both countries and academic institutions and researchers become motivated, are given incentives towards this cooperation. And so that's going to require our governments to not only maintain commitment internally, but also in some ways to liberate us, to get out of our way and let us get on with that relationship.
Thank you, Rory. That's wonderful. We just right at the end of time. I just want to summarize this. Thank you first for spending the time with us on a Saturday afternoon. Thank you for the participants for joining us on Saturday morning at a time when you have classes and other household errands and chores and other things. So thanks for joining us. I just want to conclude by saying that, look, I'm not entirely an unbiased commentator on the book or the arguments in the book, but I think it stands to reason that this book is probably the first we have seen that comprehensively makes the argument for the new geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific at a time when most countries have sort of gravitated to the fact that they have to deal with the world as it is and not as they hope to be. And I do hope that in the coming years, India will be a more significant actor in the Indo-Pacific and in a way fulfill a lot of the predictions and the hopes expressed by Rory Medcalf in his book. So thank you all very much and have a great weekend.
Thank you, and it's been a real pleasure, and I wish you all a safe time in the months ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Rory.